Say your own name out loud 10 times in a row. Somewhere around the 6th or 7th time, it stops sounding like a name. It turns into noise, a strange arrangement of sound with no meaning attached, and for a second, you don't recognize the thing you've answered to your entire life. That glitch isn't a fluke. It's a crack in something you've trusted without question since before you could talk. The belief that what you perceive is simply what's there. Your brain doesn't record reality. It builds a version of it in real time and hands you the finished product labeled what's actually happening. In the next few minutes, you're going to find out the one fact that changes how much you can trust what your own eyes and your own memory are telling you right now, because both of them have been lying to you convincingly since before you learned to talk. I want to tell you about the day I found out one of my clearest childhood memories never happened. I remembered it in full color, the way you only remember the handful of moments that actually mattered. I was maybe 7, standing in my grandmother's kitchen, and I dropped a glass bowl that shattered across the tile, and she yelled, really yelled in a way she never did. And I remember the specific fear of it, the way the light came through the window at that hour, the pattern on the bowl before it hit the ground. I told this story for years. It was one of my go-to memories, the kind you reach for when someone asks what your grandmother was like. Then, at a family gathering in my 20s, I told the story again, expecting the usual laugh, and my mother looked at me strangely and said, "That never happened. Not you're misremembering the details. Never happened." My grandmother, she said, never yelled at anyone in her life, and there was no broken bowl. Not that day. Not any day anyone could recall. What had actually happened, reconstructed later from other relatives, was a much smaller, blander incident. A cup, not a bowl. A startled "oh" instead of a yell, an entirely different year. If you've had a version of this happen to you, a memory you'd have sworn to in court, corrected by someone who was actually there, you know the specific vertigo of it. It's not like being wrong about a fact you looked up somewhere. It's being wrong about something that felt like direct experience, something with light and sound and fear attached to it, something that had every texture of having actually happened to you. What made it worse, honestly, is how long I'd been using that memory. I'd told it at dinner parties. I'd told it to a therapist once as an example of my grandmother's temper, part of a whole narrative I'd built about her contradictions, warm most of the time, capable of a frightening edge underneath. An entire small theory of her character, resting partly on an event that never occurred. I had to sit with the uncomfortable question of how much of that theory was actually built on real observation, and how much had been quietly reinforced by a story my own mind had manufactured and then treated as evidence. Here's what I had to sit with afterward, and it took a while before it stopped feeling like an attack on my own sense of self. My brain hadn't stored a slightly blurry recording of that day. It had built a scene, vivid, detailed, emotionally coherent, largely out of material that wasn't from that day at all. Fear I'd felt on other occasions, a kitchen I knew well enough to render in detail, a general sense of what grandmother gets upset might look like, borrowed from somewhere else entirely, and stitched seamlessly into a memory I'd have staked my identity on. This is the part that reframes the whole conversation about perceiving reality accurately. The question was never really, am I seeing things correctly right now? The far stranger and more useful question is, what is the actual relationship between what happens to you and what you end up believing happened to you? And if that relationship is looser than you assumed for something as important as a childhood memory, what does that suggest about everything smaller and more ordinary you take for granted every single day? I want to be careful here not to overcorrect into a kind of blanket distrust of everything you've ever experienced, because that's not the honest version of this either. Most of what you remember is probably close enough to accurate for ordinary purposes. You didn't hallucinate your commute this morning, and the general shape of your life history is very likely intact. What's actually at stake is narrower, and in some ways more useful than total skepticism. The specific confidence you feel about a memory tells you almost nothing reliable about how accurate it actually is, and the vivid, emotionally loaded memories, the ones you'd stake the most on, are exactly the ones most susceptible to this kind of quiet, confident reconstruction. That explains why the false memory felt so real. The brain doesn't flag reconstructed material as reconstructed. It delivers it with the same confidence as anything else. It doesn't yet explain the actual mechanism doing the reconstructing, or why evolution would build a mind that lies to itself this convincingly and this often. And that requires starting somewhere much smaller than memory, with something happening in your eyes literally right now, whether you've ever noticed it or not. Not in your imagination, in the actual physical structure of your eye, running the exact same trick memory runs, just faster and more literal. Hold your hand up in front of your face, thumb pointed toward you, at arm's length. Close your left eye. Look directly at your thumb with your right eye, and slowly move your hand out to the right, still staring straight ahead at where your thumb used to be, not following it with your eye. At some point, a coin-sized patch of whatever is out there, a piece of wall, a corner of the room, will simply vanish. Try it more than once, because the first time most people aren't entirely sure whether they've found it or whether they're imagining the effect. The second or third time, there's no ambiguity left. Something that was visibly there simply isn't, and yet nothing about your experience of looking at that spot changes. There's no sensation of a gap, no dark patch, no static, nothing that flags itself as missing information here. Whatever surrounds that coin-sized spot just continues, uninterrupted, straight through the place where actual visual data has stopped arriving entirely. Rather than going dark, blurring, or announcing itself as missing in any way, your brain simply fills the space in with whatever surrounds it. The same wall color, the same pattern, seamlessly patched, as if nothing were ever gone. That gap is called the blind spot, and it's not a rare defect. Every single person watching this has one in each eye all the time, caused by the simple anatomical fact that the optic nerve has to exit the eye somewhere, and that exit point has no light-sensing cells at all. You've had it your entire life. You've never once seen it as a whole because your visual system doesn't show you the whole. It shows you its best guess about what belongs there, with total, unearned confidence. It's worth sitting with the scale of this for a moment. This isn't a small blind spot tucked away at the extreme edge of your vision, easy to dismiss as irrelevant. Depending on the exact anatomy, it sits close enough to central vision that, without the filling in, you'd be aware of a genuinely disruptive gap every time you looked at anything. The fact that you've gone your entire life without noticing it isn't a small accomplishment of your visual system. It's one of the most aggressive, most successful pieces of confident fabrication your brain performs, running continuously, and you're only finding out about it now. Physiologists first mapped this precisely in the late 19th century. The French physicist Edmé Mariotte gets credit for the earliest formal demonstration back in the 1660s, and according to the most widely repeated account, he showed it to the court of King Charles II as a party trick, entertaining royalty with the fact that their own eyes were lying to them in real time and had been the entire visit. It's worth sitting with how long this has been known, and how little it's changed anyone's actual felt experience of seeing. You can demonstrate your own blind spot right now, understand exactly why it exists, and still walk around 5 minutes from now with zero sense that any part of your visual field is being fabricated. The patching is that good. It doesn't feel like a guess. It feels like seeing. There's something worth pausing on in the fact that this demonstration worked as courtly entertainment for centuries before anyone fully understood the mechanism behind it. People were delighted and slightly unsettled by the disappearing coin or card, long before anyone could explain that the effect came down to a simple absence of light-sensing cells at the point where the optic nerve exits the retina. The gap in understanding didn't matter to the phenomenon itself. The blind spot was doing its quiet, confident patching work in every viewer's eye, whether or not a single person in the room had the anatomy to explain it. And before you file this under interesting eye trivia and move on, notice that you're doing something structurally identical to this constantly, outside of vision entirely. You've read a text message from someone and heard a tone in it, annoyance, coldness, sarcasm, that wasn't actually encoded in the words at all. You filled a gap, the same way your visual cortex fills the blind spot, and you did it with total confidence that you'd correctly perceived something that was, in fact, partly manufactured. The parallel goes deeper than a loose metaphor. In both cases, the system delivers the completed picture with the exact same confidence as genuinely detected information, without appending any mental asterisk saying reconstructed, handle with care, because from the inside, A well-executed guess and a direct perception are functionally indistinguishable. That indistinguishability isn't a bug specific to vision or specific to memory. It appears to be a general feature of how a predictive nervous system operates, which is exactly why it's worth understanding once, clearly, rather than treating each instance, the blind spot, the misread text, the false memory, as a separate, unrelated curiosity. This is where it gets considerably stranger than a patch of wallpaper, because vision isn't the only place the brain does this, and arguably not even the most consequential one. In 1974, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, along with colleague John Palmer, ran a study that would end up reshaping how courts around the world think about eyewitness testimony. Participants watched films of car accidents, then answered questions about what they'd seen. The only variable researchers changed was a single verb. Some participants were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others were asked the exact same question, but with the word smashed instead of hit. It's worth appreciating how small that manipulation was on paper and how large its downstream effect turned out to be. Same film, same accident, same set of participants drawn from the same population, asked the exact same question in every respect, except one single word choice. If memory really worked the way most people assume, a stored recording, faithfully retrieved, a single word in a follow-up question should have had close to zero effect on what people reported having witnessed. Participants who heard smashed reported significantly higher speed estimates than those who heard hit. The same footage, producing measurably different memories based entirely on the phrasing of a question asked afterward, and it went further than speed estimates. A week later, when asked whether they remembered seeing broken glass at the scene, and there was no broken glass in the film, none at all, participants in the smashed group were significantly more likely to falsely remember glass that was never there. It's worth being precise about what this proves and what it doesn't, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets flattened into something more dramatic than it actually is. It doesn't prove memory is entirely fictional, or that nothing you remember is real. Loftus herself, across decades of follow-up research, was careful about this distinction. What it proves is that memory isn't retrieved the way a video file is retrieved, intact, complete, simply played back. It's reconstructed every single time you recall it, using whatever cues are available in the moment of recall, including cues like a single loaded word in a question that have nothing to do with the original event at all. There's a specific, almost paradoxical implication worth naming here. The more often you recall a memory, the more opportunities it has to be quietly reconstructed and subtly altered, which means your most frequently retold memories. The ones you'd assume are the most solidly anchored precisely because you've gone over them so many times are, if anything, the ones with the most accumulated opportunity for drift. The story you tell most often isn't necessarily the most accurate one. It's simply the one that's been rebuilt the most times. Later researchers, including Loftus's own subsequent work through the 1990s and 2000s, went further still, successfully implanting entire false memories in a meaningful percentage of participants. Memories of being lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that had never happened, planted through nothing more than a family member's convincing suggestion and a few guided follow-up conversations. Roughly a quarter of participants in these studies came to genuinely believe in vivid and elaborated detail in an event that never occurred. The methodology behind this is worth understanding precisely because it makes the result harder to dismiss. Researchers didn't simply tell participants, "You got lost in a mall once," and record a shrug of half agreement. They worked with family members to construct a plausible, personalized narrative, the right mall, a period in childhood that fit, sometimes a detail or two borrowed from a real memory to lend it texture, and then asked participants, across several separate sessions, to try to recall as much detail as they could about the invented event. By the final session, a substantial number of participants weren't just agreeing it might have happened. They were adding original detail, what the store looked like, what the person who eventually found them was wearing, how frightened they'd felt. None of it had happened. All of it felt, to the person recalling it, exactly like memory. Now hold this next to your own life for a second, because the honest version of this is more unsettling than the trivia version. You are not immune to this because you're careful, or because your memories feel unusually vivid. Vividness was never the safeguard. The false shopping mall memories, once implanted, were often described with more emotional detail and confidence than the participants' genuine memories from the same period. Confidence and accuracy, it turns out, are almost entirely separate variables. Measuring one tells you almost nothing reliable about the other. This has real consequences outside the laboratory, and it's part of why Loftus's work reshaped legal practice in the way it did. Eyewitness testimony for most of legal history was treated as close to the gold standard of evidence. A person saying, "I saw it happen," carried enormous weight with juries, often more weight than physical evidence that was actually more reliable. Decades of research in this tradition contributed directly to changes in how police lineups are conducted, how witnesses are interviewed, and how courts instruct juries to weigh eyewitness confidence against actual accuracy, precisely because confidence, however sincere, turned out to be such a poor predictor of whether an account was true. That validates the paradox from block one. But it opens something harder to sit with, because if your visual field is being patched in real time and your memory is being reconstructed on the fly, using whatever's convenient in the moment, what exactly is happening to the rest of your experience, the parts you're not even examining as memory or vision, the ordinary texture of an ordinary Thursday? Here's where this stops being about eyes and courtroom studies and starts being about your actual week. Think about the last time you reread a text message 4 or 5 times, hunting for tone. The words themselves never changed on the screen. What changed each time you reread it was which gap your mind decided to fill, sometimes with warmth, sometimes with distance, depending entirely on your mood in that specific moment, not on any new information the message itself provided. You weren't discovering the tone that was already there. You were doing exactly what your visual cortex does at the blind spot, patching an absence with a confident guess, and then experiencing the guess as a fact you'd detected. Think about the last argument you had with someone close to you, and how a few days later you each told a slightly different version of it, neither one of you lying, both of you genuinely believing your own account. That gap isn't a matter of one memory being better than the other. It's 2 separate reconstruction processes, each pulling from a slightly different set of cues, emotions, and prior assumptions, each producing a coherent, vivid, confidently held memory that happens to disagree with the other person's equally coherent, vivid, confidently held memory of the identical event. This shows up in families in a particularly stubborn way, because the same childhood event gets reconstructed differently by every person who lived through it, and each version hardens over years of retelling into something that feels like the objective account. Ask 3 siblings about the same holiday from 20 years ago, and you'll often get 3 internally consistent, emotionally coherent, and meaningfully different stories. Not because 2 of the 3 are lying, but because 3 separate nervous systems were doing 3 separate reconstruction jobs the whole time, using 3 different sets of available cues, and each has spent 2 decades quietly reinforcing its own version through repeated retelling. This is the actual mechanism underneath the phrase "perception is reality," which usually gets used as a throwaway line and rarely gets taken as seriously as it deserves. It was never simply a comment about subjectivity or opinion. It's closer to a literal mechanical description of how your nervous system operates. What you experience as what happened is never the raw event itself. It's always a reconstruction, built partly from sensory input and partly from expectation, memory, mood, and whatever narrative your mind already had loaded before the event even occurred. Watch how this compounds over time, the same way an old collapsed measurement compounds in any other context. You form an early impression of someone, say that they're cold or unreliable, often from a single ambiguous interaction where several interpretations were genuinely available. That impression doesn't just sit there neutrally, waiting for updated evidence. It becomes the filling material for every future blind spot involving that person. An ambiguous silence gets patched with cold, because cold is the material already sitting closest at hand. 10 interactions later, you have a confident, detailed, emotionally vivid sense of exactly who this person is, built substantially out of the original guess, reinforced and elaborated each time, rather than freshly perceived each time. There's a specific version of this worth naming, because it runs in both directions and people rarely notice the generous version happening to them. Someone who's already decided you're impressive will patch an ordinary, forgettable comment you made with extra insight it never actually contained. Someone who's already decided you're difficult will patch an ordinary, neutral comment with defensiveness or hostility that was never really there either. Neither person is lying about what they perceived. Both are running the exact same reconstruction process in opposite directions, off two different starting predictions, which means the you that other people experience is, in a very real sense, partly a product of predictions they brought into the room before you ever opened your mouth. Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. In follow-up work building on Loftus's research, roughly half of participants shown slightly misleading post-event information went on to report false details as if they'd witnessed them directly. Not because they were careless, but because the misleading detail arrived while the memory was still soft, still being assembled, not yet locked into anything resistant to outside influence. So ask yourself honestly, how many of your own confident relationship facts arrived the same way? Picked up secondhand, absorbed while the actual memory was still forming, and never separated out from what you personally witnessed. Here's the part that reframes what most people mean by seeing things clearly. You cannot simply decide to perceive raw, unfiltered reality. No human nervous system has ever operated that way, and none ever will. Even the calmest, most present person alive is still running constant reconstruction, patching gaps, filling blind spots, editing memory on retrieval. What you actually have influence over is something narrower and more achievable. Noticing when you're filling a gap instead of registering a fact, and staying curious about the fill instead of immediately trusting it as settled. Think about how this shows up in a performance review, or any moment where someone in authority delivers mixed feedback. You'll often walk away remembering the one critical line in vivid, specific detail, while the 4 sentences of genuine praise that surrounded it blur into vague, forgettable background. That's not because the criticism was objectively more significant. It's because your existing prediction about your own competence, about how these conversations tend to go, was already primed to register threat-relevant information as the main event, and everything else gets patched into supporting scenery around it. Consider how this shows up in something as ordinary as retelling your own day to a partner or a friend. You don't report the day. You report a reconstruction of the day, already edited for coherence, already smoothed into a story with a beginning, a middle, a clear emotional through line, because raw, unedited experience doesn't come in story form, and your mind can't help but supply the missing narrative structure, the same way it can't help but supply the missing patch of wallpaper. Notice, too, how differently the same day gets edited depending on who's asking and how you're feeling when you tell it. Tell a friend about a frustrating day at work, and the story arranges itself around the frustration, with the 3 genuinely fine hours quietly trimmed out as irrelevant detail. Tell your manager about the same day, and an entirely different edit emerges, organized around competence and effort instead. Neither version is a lie. Both are honest reconstructions built from the same raw material, shaped by which narrative your mind reached for first in that particular telling. This is where most people, once they learn this, swing too far in the other direction, deciding that since memory and perception are unreliable, nothing can be trusted at all, which is its own kind of overcorrection, just as unhelpful as blind confidence. That's not what this mechanism is asking of you. The ask is smaller and more precise. Hold your own confident reading of a message's tone, of an old argument, of a person's character, a little more loosely, and notice how often "I definitely remember" and "I definitely perceived" turn out, on closer inspection, to be doing a lot of quiet construction work behind the scenes. It's worth noticing, too, how rarely this construction work gets questioned in the moment it happens, precisely because questioning it takes more effort than simply trusting it. Trusting the reconstruction is fast, cheap, and usually good enough for ordinary purposes, which is exactly why the brain defaults to it constantly, the same way it defaults to patching the blind spot instead of flagging a gap. The problem was never that the shortcut exists. The problem is that the shortcut is invisible, running underneath decisions that matter far more than what's in that corner of the room. Decisions about trust, about worth, about what a relationship actually means. So if perception was never a passive recording, if it's an active, constant construction project running in the background of everything you experience, what's actually driving that construction? What decides, moment to moment, which guesses your mind reaches for first, before you've had any chance to notice a guess was even being made? It's worth pausing on that question before moving into the answer, because the honest response is stranger than your past experiences. Which is the answer? Most people would guess. It's not simply that your history shapes your guesses in some vague, general way. There's a specific, mechanical model of exactly how that shaping happens, one that treats guessing not as an occasional shortcut your brain takes when it's lazy or overwhelmed, but as the primary, constant mode in which perception operates at all times, including right now, including the room you're sitting in as you watch this. This is the layer that reframes everything covered so far, and it comes from a place most people have never heard of, even though it may be one of the most important ideas in modern neuroscience. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of perception looked something like this. Light hits your eyes, sound hits your ears, and your brain builds a picture of the world from the ground up, starting with raw sensory data and working its way toward a finished interpretation. A bottom-up process, data in, understanding out. It's an intuitive model. It's also, according to a growing body of research over the last 2 decades, largely backwards. The neuroscientist and theoretical researcher Karl Friston, building on ideas that trace back to Hermann von Helmholtz in the 19th century, has been one of the central figures behind what's now called predictive processing, or active inference. The core claim is genuinely strange the first time you hear it stated plainly. Your brain isn't primarily reacting to sensory input. It's primarily predicting sensory input, generating a constant top-down guess about what it expects to encounter next, and using the actual raw signal from your eyes and ears, mostly just to check and correct that prediction where it turns out to be wrong. It's worth sitting with how counterintuitive this actually is, because everyday language about perception assumes the opposite so thoroughly that the reversal takes real effort to hold on to. We say things like, "I saw it with my own eyes," as though seeing were a pure, unmediated act of reception, light simply arriving and being registered. Under Friston's framework, what arrives is treated more like a correction signal than a primary source, useful mainly for telling the brain where its prediction was off, rather than supplying the picture from scratch each time. Most of the actual content of your visual experience, moment to moment, is generated from the top down, not assembled from the bottom up. Under this model, what you experience as seeing the room in front of you isn't raw data arriving and being interpreted. It's a prediction, generated by your brain in advance, that gets compared against the incoming signal and adjusted only at the points where prediction and signal genuinely diverge. Most of what you see at any given moment is prediction, quietly confirmed rather than freshly detected. Only the surprising parts, the parts that violate the prediction, get the kind of full, effortful processing that feels like actually noticing something new. This is where the neuroscientist Anil Seth's phrase for it has become useful shorthand, even outside academic circles: a controlled hallucination. Not hallucination in the clinical disordered sense. The claim isn't that you're seeing things that aren't there in some pathological way. The claim is structural. Ordinary healthy perception is generated from the inside out, by prediction, and only loosely tethered moment to moment, to the raw sensory signal actually arriving. What makes it controlled, rather than a free-floating fantasy, is precisely that tether, the constant correction against incoming data. Remove that correction entirely, and you get the kind of hallucination associated with certain neurological and psychiatric conditions. Keep the correction running normally, and you get what everyone calls just seeing reality, even though the underlying process was prediction the entire time. Seth has pointed to certain visual illusions as small, safe demonstrations of exactly this mechanism at work. Images where your brain's prior expectation about faces or depth or motion actively overrides the literal information hitting your retina, producing an experience that contradicts what a camera pointed at the same scene would record. The illusion isn't a malfunction, it's the ordinary machinery of prediction, caught for a moment in a setup clever enough to expose it. The unsettling implication is that this same machinery is running just as actively when nothing is tricking you at all. You simply don't get to see it working, because when prediction and reality line up smoothly, there's no illusion to notice, just the seamless experience of normal perception. Stay with me here, because this is where it stops being abstract neuroscience and becomes something close to a description of your actual Thursday. That confident sense you have walking into a familiar room, of simply seeing what's there. Under this model, that confidence is mostly your brain's prediction being quietly confirmed, not fresh information being freshly registered. You're not really looking at the room each time you enter it. You're checking the room against a prediction of the room, built from every previous time you've been in it, and only updating the parts that surprise you. The same holds for people you know well, which is where this stops being a curiosity about furniture and starts mattering. Walking into a conversation with someone you've known for years, you're not neutrally taking in their expression, their tone, their choice of words, as if for the first time. You're checking all of it against a standing prediction of who they are, built from every previous conversation, and your conscious experience of reading them in that moment is mostly the prediction being confirmed, with only the genuinely unexpected parts receiving the kind of fresh, effortful attention that could actually update anything. It's worth being precise about the scientific status of this idea, because it's still an active, evolving area of research rather than a fully settled consensus, the way, say, the blind spot is. Predictive processing has strong and growing experimental support, from studies on visual illusions that only make sense if the brain is generating top-down predictions, to clinical research on conditions like psychosis that seem to involve miscalibrated prediction error signals. But researchers are still actively debating the details of exactly how the mechanism works at a neural level. What's not seriously in dispute is the broader shift it represents. Perception looking far more like an active generative process than a passive, receptive one. It's also worth naming honestly that this framework doesn't explain everything about consciousness, and researchers working in this area are generally careful not to claim it does. Predictive processing describes a mechanism for how perceptual content gets generated and corrected. It doesn't, on its own, resolve the much harder and still fully open question of why any of that generating and correcting is accompanied by subjective experience at all. The question philosophers sometimes call the hard problem of consciousness. This video isn't claiming otherwise. What it's claiming is narrower and already strange enough to sit with. Whatever consciousness turns out to be, the content it's built from is demonstrably more constructed, moment to moment, than it feels like from the inside. Here's the mechanism, stated as plainly as this video can manage after everything it's covered. If your brain runs on prediction rather than raw reception, then every prediction it's already carrying, about a person, about yourself, about how a situation like this one usually goes, isn't a neutral backdrop waiting to be tested against fresh evidence each time. It's actively shaping what evidence you register as evidence in the first place. An old prediction that someone doesn't value your opinion doesn't just color your interpretation of their silence after you speak. It can shape, at a genuinely perceptual level, which parts of their actual reaction you register clearly, and which parts pass by as unremarkable noise that never gets flagged as a surprise worth updating on. This is why simply trying to see clearly so often fails as advice. You can't outwill a predictive system by gritting your teeth and deciding to be objective. What actually shifts a prediction is the same thing that updates any predictive model. Repeated, genuine surprise, registered as surprise instead of explained away or absorbed into the existing prediction without protest. If you predict rejection and someone shows you warmth and you immediately explain the warmth away, they're just being polite, they want something, this doesn't count. The prediction never gets the correction it needed. The system stays exactly as calibrated as it was before, still confidently generating the same old forecast the next time around. Deliberately letting a genuine surprise register as a surprise instead of instantly explaining it back into your existing prediction is not a small or trivial act. It's the actual mechanism by which a predictive brain updates its model of reality, the neural equivalent of a scientist taking a result seriously instead of discarding it because it doesn't fit the existing theory. Every time you let a piece of disconfirming evidence actually land, instead of immediately rationalizing it away, you're doing the one thing that changes the prediction generating your experience, rather than simply padding the same old prediction with one more confirming data point it didn't actually need. There's a reason this is harder than it sounds, and it's worth naming directly instead of treating it as a simple matter of willpower. Predictions that have been running for years, especially ones tied to something as central as your sense of your own worth or lovability, don't just represent a belief you hold. They represent an enormous amount of accumulated processing efficiency. Your brain has built an entire shortcut around not having to freshly evaluate this category of situation each time. And shortcuts, once built, resist being dismantled precisely because dismantling them costs more effort than maintaining them. This isn't a moral failing. It's the ordinary economics of a prediction-based nervous system, doing exactly what it's built to do. Conserve effort by trusting its priors, even when trusting them costs you something real in the quality of your actual present moment experience. None of this requires becoming a different kind of person. It requires noticing a little more often than you currently do the exact moment a prediction is about to swallow a piece of evidence whole, instead of letting the evidence actually register on its own terms. I want to stop explaining the science for a second and just talk to you, because I think you already know which prediction has been running your perception on autopilot. I think you know exactly which relationship, which version of yourself, which old story about how people like you get treated keeps getting confirmed, not because the world keeps proving it true, but because you've stopped registering the moments that would have proven it false. You are not gullible, and you are not broken for having a brain that predicts instead of simply receiving. Every human brain works this way. It's not a flaw in you specifically. It's the actual architecture of consciousness, doing exactly what it evolved to do. Guessing fast, correcting only when the guess is expensive enough to be worth correcting. That guessing fast design made excellent sense for most of human history, when a fast, decent enough guess about a rustle in the grass mattered more than a slow, perfectly accurate one. It makes considerably less sense applied to a friendship, a marriage, or your own private sense of what you're capable of, situations where the cost of an uncorrected old guess compounds quietly for years instead of resolving in the half-second it takes to decide whether to run. I think you know already how tiring it is to keep confirming the same prediction, year after year, and calling the confirmation proof instead of noticing it's the same old guess, dressed up in new evidence you selected specifically because it would fit. But somewhere there's a specific surprise you've been explaining away instead of letting land, a piece of warmth you dismissed, a piece of evidence that someone actually meant what they said, a small sign that the story you've been telling about yourself might not be the only available story. Maybe it's a compliment you've heard more than once and still can't quite let register as true, quietly re-explaining it each time as politeness or luck, or the other person not knowing you well enough yet. Maybe it's a relationship that keeps showing you steadiness, and some old well-worn prediction keeps insisting steadiness like this always turns out to be temporary, so you brace instead of actually receiving it. Maybe it's simply the version of your own competence you've been running since a single hard year a long time ago, still generating the same forecast for every new situation, regardless of how much evidence has quietly piled up against it since. You don't have to overhaul your whole nervous system today. You just have to notice the next time a genuine surprise shows up and let it actually surprise you instead of immediately filing it under doesn't count. Back to where we started. Your own name repeated until it stopped sounding like a name. The first small crack in the belief that you simply perceive the world as it is. Here's the one-sentence version of everything this video has actually tried to say. Nothing you experience arrives to you raw. It arrives already built, predicted, patched, and reconstructed, and the only real choice available to you is whether you keep confirming the same old build or let genuine surprise revise it. Say your own name again once right now and notice how ordinary it sounds this time. Solid, meaningful, exactly like your name. Nothing about the mechanism changed since the start of this video. Only your awareness of it did. And here's the layer I didn't tell you at the start, because nothing is real sounds on the surface like a much bleaker claim than the one this video is actually making. This was never an argument that your experience doesn't matter, or that reality is some kind of elaborate lie with nothing solid underneath it. The blind spot is still getting patched with the actual wall behind it, most of the time. The prediction your brain runs is still built substantially from real, honest sensory history, not random noise. What changes is something quieter and in its own way more hopeful. Once you know the reconstruction is happening, you're no longer simply at its mercy. You can start noticing which predictions have gone stale, which patches were filled in decades ago and never checked since, which confident memories deserve a little more humility than you've been giving them. There's a specific kind of relief available here if you let it land instead of treating it as unsettling. You were never actually required to perceive reality perfectly in order to live a good life. Nobody ever has, and nobody ever will. What's actually available to you isn't flawless perception. It's the considerably more achievable practice of catching your own confident guesses in the act, often enough that the ones causing real damage, the old prediction about your worth, the old story about how a specific relationship always goes, eventually get the correction they've been waiting years to receive. That's what nothing is real actually points to once you strip the nihilism off it. Not that nothing matters. That you have more editorial control over your own experience than you ever gave yourself credit for. Because you were already editing, constantly, without permission, without noticing, the entire time. The only real question left is whether you keep editing on autopilot or start doing it on purpose. Think about what actually changes if you carry only this much forward. The next time a memory arrives with total, unquestioned confidence, or a message reads with a tone you're certain is there, you give yourself one extra beat before treating the reconstruction as fact. Not to doubt everything, but to remember that certainty was never the measure of accuracy in the first place. That's the whole practice, in its smallest form. Not distrust of your own mind. A little more humility toward its confident guesses. You were never just watching your life happen. You were building it one prediction at a time, whether you knew it or not. If this video gave you language for something you'd half-sensed but never had the words for, that's exactly what this channel exists to do every week. Subscribing isn't a favor to me. It's a private agreement with the version of you that's ready to start noticing the edits instead of trusting them automatically. That's who this channel is built for. Comment, I choose to notice. Tomorrow, something stranger. What happens when you actually let yourself accept your future as a fourth dimension, sitting right beside you, closer than you think? I'll see you there.